Tartaria, the civilization buried alive. They erased the people, the buildings, and the entire timeline, but they missed a few things. Let's go. We're digging up the empire that never fell. They just buried it. You've walked through cities built by ghosts, seen cathedrals no one can explain. Tunnels beneath buildings that shouldn't be that deep. Windows, underground. There's a reason it feels off, because something used to be here, and someone didn't want you to remember. This is Emspiracy, and this is the empire that vanished without a war. What was Tartaria? Tartaria wasn't a country. It was a world-spanning empire, predating the US, spanning Asia, Europe, Russia, and parts of North America, even showing up on maps as recently as the 1700s. No major wars to end it. No stories of conquest. Just gone. And when it disappeared, something strange happened. History restarted. Buildings that don't match the story. Look around any major city. London, Paris, New York, even Istanbul. The grand cathedrals, giant stone arches, intricate domes, steel and marble designs no one builds anymore. And they're all dated 1850 to 1890. Built by horse and buggy settlers, with no modern tools, no electricity, no blueprints. That's not architecture. That's inheritance. We didn't build them. We were given the ruins. The mud flood. In photos from the 1800s and early 1900s, you'll notice half-buried doorways, windows below street level, entire city blocks excavated downward, thick layers of sediment covering structures. Textbooks call it settling or foundation design, but when you put the puzzle together, it looks like the aftermath of a global flood of earth. Not water, mud, a mud flood. One massive event, or a series, that buried Tartaria, and then came the rewrite. You weren't taught this because it breaks the timeline. And once you see it, it's everywhere. We didn't build the past, we built on top of it. This is Emspiracy, and this is only the first layer.
The cities were still standing, but where were the people? No war, no bones, just empty empires. And then suddenly, orphans, trains full of them, millions. Where did they come from? And more importantly, where did everyone else go? Between the 1850s and 1920s, over 250,000 orphan children were shipped across America on trains. No parents, no paperwork, just tags around their necks. But this wasn't just in the US. The UK shipped orphans to Canada and Australia. Russia relocated displaced children by the tens of thousands. Even in France, entire towns were suddenly flooded with new children and no record of where they came from. Question, if the population was growing, where were the adults?
The inheritance theory. What if the buildings weren't built by the 1800s generation, but left behind? And the orphan trains weren't adoption. They were repopulation. Clean the surface, erase the timeline, send in the children, teach them new history. Those kids became the first generations of settlers, the ones who built cities already built, the ones who told their children a script, not a memory. It was a reset, a global handover. They told you they were forts, defensive structures, cannon stations. But who defends a fort with perfect sacred geometry? Why build them on ley lines? Why bury them? Why does no one know who built them? What are star forts really? From the sky, they look like snowflakes. From the ground, they look like ruins. But star forts are found all across Europe, Asia, and North and South America in near identical design, built before modern history explains them, and always on key magnetic points near water sources, in geometries that match somatic resonance patterns. These weren't military, they were tech.
The timeline doesn't add up. Here's where it glitches. Electricity was invented after buildings were already wired. Cities had canals and trolleys before roads. Fires and great quakes conveniently wiped out archives in Boston, San Francisco, Chicago, and London. The 1800s are a fog, full of unexplained tech, lost photographs, and missing identities. History didn't evolve, it was overwritten. And the people who lived before, scrubbed? We've been living in someone else's house, wearing their clothes, speaking their tongue, but they didn't leave willingly. And if you listen closely, the ruins are still telling their side.
Draw lines between the star forts. Something happens. You get perfect symmetry, cross-continental connections, a literal world circuit. These locations pulse with strange frequencies. Compass glitches, EMF surges, tree growth distortions, animal migration anomalies. They weren't just buildings, they were nodes. Tartaria wasn't just a civilization, it was an energy system. The reset buried the circuit. After the mud flood, many star forts were filled in with dirt. Others were turned into tourist sites with no functional explanation. Some were turned into parks or fenced off as military restricted zones. Why erase them? Because if you studied their layout long enough, you'd see a power network. Not nuclear, not fossil, natural energy, pulled from the earth, air, water and sound. Tartarian buildings weren't just beautiful, they were tuned. Domes that amplified sound, towers that harmonized frequency, metallic spires shaped to move charge, copper roof structures positioned like antennas. They didn't need power lines. The architecture was the power source. The buildings fed off the earth, and the people lived inside a world of clean, harmonic, free-flowing energy. Until the reset, until the silence, they buried the cities, filled the circuits with dirt, taught us to call them ruins. But underneath the story, the grid is still live, and some of us can feel it. This is Emspiracy, and we're not just uncovering the past, we're waking it up. The mud flood. In photos from the 1800s and early 1900s, you'll notice half-buried doorways, windows below street level, entire city blocks excavated downward, thick layers of sediment covering structures. Textbooks call it settling or foundation design, but when you put the puzzle together, it looks like the aftermath of a global flood of earth. Not water, mud, a mud flood. One massive event, or a series, that buried Tartaria, and then came the rewrite. You weren't taught this because it breaks the timeline. And once you see it, it's everywhere. We didn't build the past, we built on top of it. This is Emspiracy, and this is only the first layer. The antennas in disguise. Cathedrals, mosques, temples, even old town halls. They all share the same structure. Copper domes, pointed spires, rose windows with somatic patterns, pipe organs tuned to forgotten frequencies. These weren't for ceremony, they were receivers, amplifiers, transmuters, pulling in energy from above and cycling it through the city. They weren't praying, they were charging the ether network. The word ether appears constantly in pre-1900s texts. It was described as a medium that carries a light, a field that powers life, an energy layer that fills the air. Tartarian tech used ether towers to pull energy from the sky. You see them now as bell towers, obelisks, spires, forgotten poles capped with metal spheres.
Tartarian cities weren't powered like ours.
They breathed, water ran beneath them, vibration echoed through their walls. Buildings were alive with charge.
They say water has no memory, but old tech says otherwise. Domed fountains tuned to specific tones, pools that vibrated at healing frequencies, public baths that aligned with celestial cycles. The water carried more than current. It carried intelligence, and we built over it with concrete, plastic, and noise.
The silence that followed. Then came the fires, the earthquakes, the rebuilds. They stripped the copper, knocked down the towers, rewrote the purpose. They told us the tech was myth, the ether was nonsense, and the silence was normal. But listen closely, some towers still hum, some buildings still pulse. And some of us, we still hear the signal. They didn't destroy the old world, they muted it. But you can only suppress resonance for so long. The towers are still standing, the stone still remembers, and the pulse is returning. And the system they buried might still be active. What happens when a civilization gets too advanced, too self-sustained, too independent? They stop needing the systems we were born into. So they did what they always do, reset. But this wasn't a natural disaster. This wasn't an accident. This was intentional. There are dates in history that don't match. The 1750s is one of them. The 1830s is another. Suddenly new technologies disappear and new architectures emerge. But the reset wasn't a global catastrophe. It was a controlled collapse. Why? Because Tartaria was self-sustained, no centralised control, no external dependence, no energy grid. And what do you do when a society becomes too powerful? You erase it, and you take its energy. How they wiped the past? The reset wasn't just about destroying buildings, it was about destroying memory. Old maps were altered, texts were destroyed or hidden, and ancient wisdom were made illegal. People were moved, divided and scattered. They erased the blueprints of free energy. They erased the knowledge of harmonic architecture. They erased the people, moving them around, orphaning them. And for what? So they could take control. So they could rebuild the grid on their terms. The world we know today is built on a design. A network that's efficient, but also limiting. Energy now moves through wires instead of air. Cities are shaped by grids, not flow. Every part of life, down to your time and attention, runs on a meter. But the old world, it moved differently. Their systems worked with nature, power flowed freely, and structures resonated with the world around them. That kind of balance wasn't forgotten, it was put away, buried, not lost. And now, something's starting to stir. The gates are thinning, but here's the thing they didn't account for. You can bury a civilization, you can rewrite a timeline, but you can't stop the pulse. The gates are weakening, the energy is rising, the truth is bleeding through the cracks. And one day those gates will open. The reset was never meant to last. It was only temporary. The story of Tartaria is not over, it's only waiting. This is Emspiracy, and we're remembering what they tried to erase.